U.S. party switch. 1980 presidential election by county, Republican nominee Ronald Reagan, who lost Georgia to Democrat incumbent Jimmy Carter by 15 percentage points, only carried the southern states of Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Tennessee by very narrow margins. A significant amount of the region continued to vote Democrat for years well after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The alleged U.S. party switch claim made by liberals one and progressives two over decades is a political hoax and conspiracy theory that attempts to smear the Republican Party. The narrative, which has been crafted with the help of communists, who infiltrated the Democratic Party over the decades and who are known to lie, deceive, and engage in historical revisionism for the sake of being contrarian typically assumes that the Democrat and Republican parties switched sides during the 1960s, where the Republican Party somehow became the party of racists and the Democrats suddenly becoming the champions of civil rights. Many reputable historians and political scientists such as Carol Swain, see this video, and political commentators such as Bob Parks 6-7 strongly agree that the parties did not switch sides as the Democrats only switched strategies with communist help. While many modern leftists will note the liberal policies promoted by the Republican establishment for a while during the 1900s that dissipated in the 1960s to promote their myth, it's important to note the conservative roots of the early foundations of the Republican Party, as mentioned below. Leftists also falsely characterize President Dwight D. Eisenhower as a liberal Republican 9-10 when he tended to favor conservative policies 11-12. Some leftists including the extremist hate group Occupy Democrats imply that the current Republican Party models past racist Democrats in using racially charged baiting to maintain their voter base. This is false, as patriotic conservative Republicans since the party's foundation have consistently advocated for the same pro-civil rights, pro-human rights, pro-free market, pro-business, pro-tariff, and nationalist principles as well as emphasizing on individual responsibility. Furthermore, these liberal charges ignore the fact that the modern-day Democratic Party treats black voters in the same respect it regarded poor Southern whites in the past. Contents. Show. Civil Rights Acts. C. Civil Rights Act of 1957 and Civil Rights Act of 1964. Civil Rights Act of 1957. Map of electoral votes in the 1968 United States presidential election. Senator William F. Knowland, R.C.A., ensured the Senate passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Liberals often point to Lyndon B. Johnson's so-called advocacy for civil rights to push the myth. This was despite the fact that Johnson worked to water down the 1957 Civil Rights Act, weakening it down by removing the stringent voting protection clauses 14 in addition to adding a jury trial amendment 15 which then Senator John F. Kennedy, joining segregationists at the urging of Johnson, voted for 16. The latter was to ensure that little to no progress on civil rights would be made in the South, as the jury would almost certainly acquit the defendant 15 segregationist Florida Senator George Smothers also helped Johnson's scheme. Citation needed. It was afterwards that the legislation was passed, in which Johnson then supported in the final Senate floor vote 17. It was reported that the Texas Democrat had referred to the legislation as the N Bill. 18. A strong advocate of the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was Republican William Knowland of California, who was mostly conservative and an ardent anti-communist 1920 who voted against the censure of Joseph McCarthy 21. Knowland voted against measures supported by the majority of Democrats to water down the bill 1622 and ensured the legislation's passage in the Senate 23-24-25. Civil Rights Act of 1964. One of the most important aspects of perpetuating this myth is the faux talking point surrounding the response by Southern Dixiecrats to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act 26. The myth involves looking at a map of the 1960 electoral map and comparing it to the 1964 electoral map, all while ignoring the results of the 1968 presidential electoral map. Aided by leftist historians, 27-1 is supposed to see the Democrats winning the South in 1960, losing it in 1964. And concluding that this must be where the party switch took place. For this myth to hold, Republicans should have won the South in as large of numbers in 1968 as in 1964, though they didn't. In the United States presidential election of 1968, Republicans lost almost the entirety of the South. Democrat George Wallace, running on a third-party ticket, took a bulk of the Deep South and Republicans even lost Texas to the Humphrey/Muskie ticket. Additionally, as correctly noted by conservative intellectual Dinesh D'Souza, the passage of the Civil Rights Act had greater Republican support than it did Democrat support. 28 of the 6 Republican senators who voted against the final passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Goldwater, left, Hickenlooper, second from left, Cotton, center from right, and Simpson, right, were principled conservatives/libertarians who adamantly supported civil rights for blacks but opposed sections of the bill that would increase the size and scope of the federal government, despite leftist whitewashing that especially attempts to smear the Arizona senator as racist. All of them voted for other civil rights legislation, though tended to favor such measures on the statewide level rather than on the federal level due to concerns of an expanding federal bureaucracy. So if there may have been some Southerners upset that the Civil Rights Act passed while blaming Democrats along the way, they would not have chosen as their home the Republican Party, who were the act's greatest supporters. Of the 171 Republicans in the House in 1964, 136 of them voted for it. 29 of the 33 Republicans in the Senate, 27 of them voted for it. 30 This is 79% of House Republicans, and 82% of Senate Republicans. It's furthermore important to note that all 3 Republican senators opposing the 1964 bill who were also in office during the 1957 Civil Rights Act, Barry Goldwater, R.A.Z., Bork Hickenlooper, R.I.A., and Norris Cotton, R.N.H., had voted in favor of the latter. 17 most Northern Republican representatives, such as Harold Royce H.R. Gross of Iowa, who voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, had mixed records overall on civil rights. A number of them also supported the 1957 Bill 31. While the Southern Republicans who voted against civil rights legislation were beholden to their constituencies over their party's support for civil rights. Democrat Senator Albert Gore, Sr. fervently opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act and unsuccessfully sought to weaken the bill. On the Democrat side, 153 of 244 House and 46 of 67 Senate members voted yes. That is 63% of Democrat House members and 69% of Democrat Senate members. These numbers become even more bleak for the party myth idea when you compare the yes and no votes from Northern and Southern Democrats. Virtually every Southern Democrat voted against the Civil Rights Act, meaning that Southern voters had no reason to punish them. Additionally, while the bill was on the Senate floor, it was the subject of filibustering from Southern Democrats for 57 days, 32, the longest filibuster in U.S. history. It was a Northern Republican, Everett Dirksen of Illinois, who broke the filibuster. Dirksen was a noted conservative, along with then House Minority Leader Charles A. Halleck, a prominent member of the Conservative Coalition who was also an advocate for the legislation. The two became famous during the time, with the congressional leadership statement then being known as the Ev and Charlie Show. 33. Other conservative Republicans included Joseph W. Martin, a strong civil rights advocate from Massachusetts and leader of the coalition, though more moderate compared to Halleck, Leslie Aarons, and Robert A. Taft. 34. The modern-day Democratic Party is mostly shaped by the party leadership of Lyndon Johnson, who made it much more liberal. Realizing that segregationists getting their way would destroy the party on a national level, he flip-flopped as president from his past opposition to civil rights in publicly announcing his support for and signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This ensured that the Democratic Party's history of racism could be whitewashed via deceit. 35. Johnson, a racist who privately held a strong contempt for blacks, was purported by credible accounts to have once said 18. I'll have the men voting Democratic for 200 years.